things off, Tony McWhirter from Operations Director at Perform HR. So what Tony lacks in vertical presence, she enjoys overcompensating for in humour and general argumentativeness. Probably why she's landed on this afternoon's panel. When it comes to sustainability and CSR, Tana's a strong believer that purposeful vision drives purposeful work and happier employees. We have Trudy Lanark from Port Waratah Coal Services.
That's me, not him.
Environmental and Community Relations Manager and part of the Executive Committee at Port Waratah Coal Services. Trudy has the privilege to lead the Port Waratah Coal Services sustainability strategy, including community and stakeholder engagement, the Community Investment and Partnership Program, and all aspects of environmental management. She holds a Bachelor of Laws and Bachelor of Science and has previously worked with Rio Tinto as an Environmental and Planning Approval Specialist in the Hunter Valley. Trudy is passionate about sustainability in the resources sector and building authentic, constructive relationships. This passion and experience shapes her approach to social licence to operate. Steve Main, on the end. Managing Director of PKF Sydney and Newcastle for over 9 years. Steve is also the Director of the Mutual Bank in Maitland. When Steve took the reins from the founder of the firm, Terry Lawler, he found himself at the helm of a firm that today has a very different culture, yet with a long-standing values. His leadership over the time has been instrumental in evolving the business to a firm considered innovative and forward-thinking, where employees are committed to giving value to their clients and support to their teammates and giving something back to the community. With open plan seating, where no one gets an office, drinks trolley Fridays, which you might have to explain a bit later.
Should have it on Friday.
And a plethora of social community events. PKF is a place for a healthy work, with a healthy workplace culture. One of the questions Steve gets asked a lot is, how do you create a good workplace culture? And today that's what he's here to tell us. So I thought we could start today with passing it to our panellists, I guess some questions on what CSR means to them, and I guess get the conversation flowing a little bit about the topic and a bit of an introduction. If you know, like myself, up until a couple of weeks ago, you haven't had much to do with CSR within your own businesses. And then from there we could pass it out and do a bit of a case study and come back and have a bit more of a chat about that and what everyone thinks and what they've found within that case study. So I'll start off with yourself, Steve, and what does sustainability and CSR mean to you and your business?
Yeah, look, thanks. I think obviously it's around balancing up social, economic and environmental aspects to business. But I think it's broader than that in the sense of, from a cultural point of view, it's really having that balance in your people that says, yes, we're here to get a job done and we're here to run a sustainable business, but equally there's a whole lot of stakeholders in the business that are beyond just us people in the business itself, and really recognising that in everything that they do day in, day out. So it's not just about bottom line profit at any cost, but equally looking at, yes, we need to make profit, but are we looking out for each other? Are we looking out for those less fortunate in the community? What could we give back in the way that we structure ourselves? What could we do? And that goes right down to, e.g. for us here, it's about facility. How's the facility set up? To are we paperless? To are those things that can all add to, let's call it the social and environmental piece, whilst as a business economically, clearly in what we do day in, day out, we're here to help people make money. And so it's balancing up those two things or those three things on a day-to-day basis in everything we do.
Yeah, thanks. Tani?
So, interesting one for me. I guess I'm the little guy on the panel in that we're quite a small business compared to Steve and Trudy's organisations, but we work with a whole range of clients at various sizes. And for me personally, as a business leader and director, the authenticity piece is quite difficult to really grasp. And to Steve's point around culture, it all comes back to the why are we doing this. The initiatives that we kind of pursue and the initiatives that our clients pursue, how does that connect back to their business goals, but also what's the purpose that we can communicate to the team in a really authentic way. We have a joke internally about keep cups. You know, the purpose of keep cups are great, but they come in packaging and they come with a logo on them. So the authenticity of a keep cup has kind of lost its genuine merit, I suppose. And so internally, when a CSR initiative or an engagement project is a little bit on the nose, we refer to it as the keep cup of that genre. So what do? We're a company of 30 consultants, 29 of which are women. We're very, very strong in that space, really connected with how women need to, what women need from a workplace to really show up and get what they want out of their jobs. So an example specifically, recently we introduced balance leave, which is essentially an additional 116 hours per year of leave for the team to use as they choose. So they're getting 2.5 weeks to take a holiday or to give back on their own, with their own choices in mind. So we try to give without controlling, I suppose. That's the point of view.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's a good example. I like the keep cup. Trudy?
So I take quite a broad view of sustainability, and being part of heavy industry on the harbour here, it's really important to our social licence to operate. So that's a concept that we talk about a lot with our employees. Rob can vouch for that. And for us, we take some guiding principles from the UN. So you've all heard of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, I hope. So they're a set of 17 goals, and there's good one, Jude, with 169 targets associated with them. And what we've done as a business is we've been maturing our business strategy and integrating our focus on sustainability within that. And 2017, we mapped our business as usual activities against those goals, and it was quite surprising to see the number of touch points that we do have. So for us, it's health and safety, it's environmental responsibility, it's being a responsible company and thinking about the host community that we operate in and what are our responsibilities to those stakeholders. It's treating our employees right and doing what's fair, and our values guide how we do that as a business. So that's what my take on sustainability is, and I think CSR is a concept that I think, to me, sits somewhat within sustainability, because I see sustainability so much broader than just responsibility to your stakeholders.
How do you balance operating costs against sustainability and CSR? Can you provide some examples? Do you want to run with that one, Judy?
Yeah, so I don't see it as simple as a balancing act, and I don't see it just as a financial thing. For me, I like to think about it as managing risk and opportunities and how you go about that. So there's ways, it's not always balancing a sustainability ideal against operating costs, because those two things could go hand in hand sometimes, and other times, yeah, you might need to make a decision where this route's going to be slightly more expensive, but there's valid reasons to do that, because you're mitigating noise risk, for instance, with your surrounding neighbours. That's one thing that we've done. So we've got a program of noise attenuation of our drives at the Carrington terminal, because we've got 10,000 neighbours next to the Carrington terminal and we don't want to keep them up at night. So we put in more expensive low noise drives, but it's about risk for us. And then there's other things that are more opportunity based, but I don't see it as a straight financial thing. I think it's different. So what do you think?
I think the cynical person could take this to the nth degree, no matter what the opportunity or the risk is that it's on the table. The cynical person could take any great act of good and justify it for a business cause, yeah? A leader of a large not-for-profit organisation once said to me that with more, he feels that they can do more. And I think I really like that principle and that guiding belief that if the business and the people are doing well, then we can continue to do good. And it's about being really, really clear about how that vision and purpose is aligned to an outcome for someone or something. So getting behind causes that can connect to why you exist. Because if those two things are on the same path, then business and good becomes one and the same, which is, yeah, that's a heart to what Trudy was saying.
Steve?
Yeah, and I'd extend on that. I think it all comes back to culture and your people. I think if you get that piece right, then the balancing act tends to take care of itself in an organisation. So, yeah, as an example, we run a concept here called Think Tank, which is ideally it's about areas we could improve the way we do business, maybe new revenue lines, new opportunities, new technologies, etc. But some of the ideas we get through because of the culture we have around CSR is, the most recent winner was a concept of where we buy our toilet paper from, where X% of every roll purchased goes into helping overseas developing countries in building infrastructure. So I think that's an example of where if you don't sort of so much worry about the balance of operating costs, but more focus on the culture and the ingrained way people think, then the rest tends to take care of itself from a sustainable point of view.
Thanks. How do you ensure your company's pursuing CSR? Why is that important? Why is this important? Steve, do you want to continue on?
For me, it's all about culture. Yeah, I think that's the be all and end all of it. To be honest, in regards to, as I say, the example I just gave is, I think if you've got a clear path of where you want to go, the culture's good, and you truly live out your values in an authentic way, then maintaining that ethos around CSR becomes an easier process. I think when you try to make it unauthentic, and we've all seen the examples, and we'll go through some examples in a moment around where it is just become words on a policy or words on a website, that actually every other activity that's happening behind the scenes is quite against that. Well, you're never going to get the true CSR outcome that you want. So to me, it's all about culture.
And can I ask a question, I guess, to scale it to smaller businesses, to people that work within the room with smaller businesses? How do you, I guess, if you are pursuing it, how do you measure that on a regular basis, or is it more of a quarterly basis, or what's something you can do to try and keep on top of it?
You're talking culture? Or?
Yeah, well, just in general, really making sure that your social impact is where you want it to be.
Yeah, look, I think it's just, your eyes and ears in and around the organisation, like culture's not these words on a page. Culture's the habits and the things that people do day in, day out, in the way that they act with each other, with clients, with the community, etc. So it's actually, if you get it right, and it's not something you ever get right, but if you get it right, sort of the evidence takes care of itself, I think, in terms of how your people are, retention rates of your people, things that they share that they're doing in the community and get shared back to you around doing it in the community. And I honestly think, irrespective of whether you're a 3 or 5 person organisation, or you're like us, nearly 300, it doesn't matter. It's the same sort of approach. It just becomes a bigger scale of how you've got to make that happen.
Okay.
But the ethos of what you do is the same.
Thanks. Tani?
I think when you work in a great organisation with a great culture, I see organisations without great cultures. So what I do on a day-to-day basis, we're not only working with really good teams, but we're also working with really shitty ones. And that might be a founder that's got a terrible attitude and treats his or her team like they're resources to move around the board. It might be a culture that's been issues have been left to fester, and those issues are now cancerous and are spreading. But in those organisations, which are far from the you know, the Disneyland that PKF is, I mean that with, with Humour Steve, they're a long way from being that truly driven, sustainable organisation. And in those cases, sometimes from a position of people leadership or people development, it really does need to be the business case that wins first. It's like that saying, fake it till you make it. The authenticity will come, but sometimes the metrics and the business case and the numbers need to drive sustainable change as well. And so to your question, Jude, about how do you measure it, it comes back to all of the metrics that you would all be well familiar with. If you can put it down to a line on the P&L, then you've nailed it. For some organisations, so startups for example, do those founders genuinely care about sustainability and CSR? Sometimes that's what their business is built on, but other times they will buy the plastic straws because they're much, much cheaper than any alternatives, and they've got no money. So it's a difference between keeping the doors open and being ethical in their actions. So for those organisations, we can make the case, for example, that they're working towards either investment or IPO. And so it comes back to, what do you want the board to see? What do you want your investors to see? What do you want the public to see? And those metrics can drive really great change, and it can be the foundation for great culture as well.
Trudy?
So I think sustainable business is smart business, and I think building on the point around culture, it's got to be real, it's got to be tangible, you've got to have examples that make sense for your employees, but you also need to think more broadly about the other stakeholders as well, because there'll come a point in most businesses where there'll be some curveball from a stakeholder that you weren't expecting, and you need to be able to manage that and deal with that in an authentic way. So I think that's what sustainability, why pursuing it is really important for a business, because you need to have your business strategy, but you also need to have your value proposition demonstrated with real tangible examples.
We're going to jump into, I guess, some more scandalous businesses, but I really wanted to hear from the three of you if you could provide an example of a company that is truly embracing sustainability and CSR. Obviously not your own fabulous businesses, but if you could provide some examples of businesses that you think are really embracing, and also give examples on why. If you want to start that off, Steve.
Yeah, I'm actually going to praise Port Waratah. I think locally there's a whole plethora of things that they do, you know, in and around. We've heard some examples of just at a technical, practical level, but I think if you look at, you know, their partnerships and community fund and program, and how the encouragement of all employees, and I've had some, you know, personal exposure to that through Harry Mayne Foundation, you know, which Port Waratah have been a great supporter of our foundation over the years. But equally, I know even as recently, you might have seen what they've done with some of that playground equipment and so on in the Stockton community. Yeah, I could go on and on and on, but I think if you look at what they do as an organisation day in, day out with regards to, you know, handling coal onto ships and the like, and that yet look at what they do in the broader community, that I think demonstrates a very you know, balanced corporate social responsibility, where you can clearly see it's not just about bottom line dollar.
Yeah, I'm quite impressed with your noise reduction on one of the 10,000 neighbours, so very happy with that. Tani, would you like to give an example?
There's an Australian startup called Glam Corner. I see some nice handbags in the room.
Yeah.
So Glam Corner are essentially sustainable fashion. They're a B Corp certified company. They lend clothes. They lend fashion, high-end and even high street fashion to women, and it's all in the name of sustainable fashion, because it's the amount of waste from clothing and textiles is incredible. I've been behind the scenes with Glam Corner, and they really live that vision in their everyday operations as well. So from where they choose to have their office, to consider public transport access, through to just the fixtures and fittings in their office, and the way they treat their employees and engage their team. It really shines through their ops.
Yeah, great, thanks for the example. Trudy?
Can I have two?
Definitely.
So I take a lot of inspiration from some of our local not-for-profits and just how deeply purpose-driven they are. So the likes of Soul Cafe and Jenny's Place and the Harry Mayne Foundation. I think as corporates, we can learn a lot from the way not-for-profits connect with their why and how they deliver their services. It's very admirable because sometimes you can get caught up in corporate life and you don't see the forest for the trees, and those guys don't have that space to do that. They're all about the why. So I find them pretty inspirational and bringing back some of their learnings to our business. And on a more global scale, I admire what Unilever is doing in this space. So there's lots of commentary around how Unilever lead with sustainability and how they've partnered with NGOs, and is that due to great marketing of that, or is it real? But at the end of the day, they have 28 sustainable product lines out of 400 or whatever, and those 28 sustainable product lines drive some of their growth. So they account for that, and they still use things like palm oil, and they try to ethically source their palm oil, but they've come out and said, no, we're still going to use palm oil. So we're just going to try and get more sustainably farmed palm oil. And I think that's commendable, to take on those tough issues head on and work with them.
This was good last year. There was some really big scandals, and obviously everyone loves talking about a scandal, but in particular there are some more recent ones with Facebook and Google and the Banking Royal Commission. I have really left this open. I've got some talking points there to run with, but I'd be happy for you guys to talk to some topics that you know really well. I found this extremely bit of a nerd here, but when I started researching this to help out with tonight, I found this really interesting, and so I just kept reading and reading and reading, and I ended up printing like 15 different CSR scandals and taking them away with me, and that's why I've left the Volkswagen one on the table, and we're going to use that as a bit of a case study shortly. But yeah, I found this very interesting, and I think everybody else will. I'm happy for Trudy. Do you want to kick off tonight with an example and walk us through, I guess, some of the issues that some of these businesses, or some that you might know yourself, and some of the outcomes as well?
Yeah, okay. Well, I might maybe talk about my views on the Banking Royal Commission first. So you'd have to have your head stuck in the sand to not see some of those examples the last 12 months. And for me, watching that and listening to some of the community members and customers who've had to, had quite traumatic experiences, and then the lack of systems around that and values within the banking sector, it really struck me that for the first time at a national level, the banking industry is going through something that the mining industry has been dealing with for a couple of decades. So there's a lot of similarities there for me. So that whole concept of social licence, it's just demonstrated in a different way. And I think that's really important to understand about sustainability and CSR. It's got to be material to your business, and it's got to be material to your stakeholders. So understanding the material issues for yourself and your business is really, really important. And somewhere along the way, what's material to some of the banks and the way they were pushing their products, that they lost that. They lost what they were there to do, and quite focused heavily on the bottom line.
And what do you think of some of the, I guess, the implications or some of the fines and in particular the, I guess, legal issues that have come out. When you look at the big four banks, they're massive. They probably affect everybody sitting in this room, one of those four. Yet, you know, it just doesn't seem to be, when I read through it, that there's enough being done straight away to really, I guess, bring them to justice for what's been happening.
So
What are your
that's
thoughts?
back to the point over here around regulation and legislation, fines and enforcement actions as well go so far, but the reputational damage of what they've done is far greater significance than any penalty or enforcement, because we know what their bottom line looks like. It's billions of dollars.
I think that's the issue is, you know, we've sort of seen firsthand, because of our wealth offering and being licensed, etc., is the main issue with it is that the fines that the big four banks cop is so insignificant to what they're about. But what it's done is add a whole level of regulation and a whole level of cost of doing business to the smaller players that have always done it right. And so the challenge now is, and we're seeing it come through in our news feeds, and that is where the APRA and Royal Commission and ASIC are really putting people out of business at a smaller scale because they just can't afford the cost of doing business now that it's imposed. Whereas the fine to the big four is, you know, it's almost like petty cash in the tin. And so I think that's the irony of where it's all gone. Like, the reality is none of the big four will ever truly get punished for what has happened. But what it's done is, you know, in some ways destroy part of a business for people that were doing it the right way. And so you sort of go, where's the CSR in all that? I guess.
Because they'll show a loss, but then they return huge profits.
Yeah.
So it seems,
It's all paper.
you know, as you say, the regulations tighten, but they've got the money to be able to put people in place to make sure that they're meeting those regulations, and the smaller businesses then struggle. So.
Yeah, well, the small business don't have the resource or financial capacity to defend themselves.
Yeah.
Whereas the big guys, you know, it's basically we pay for it. They just
Yeah.
pass it on to the consumer.
And
So-
there's a role for the consumer in this as well. So if you've been listening to things, you can walk with your feet these days.
Yeah,
You've got
it's
so
true.
much choice,
Yep.
and consumers look at those things and make decisions around, well, I'm going to bank with this one because they're a B Corp.
Yep.
You know, that is driving behaviour for some people.
Yeah.
I read the Chatham House rules, Jude.
Yes.
So one of the big four, they have a hiring freeze across their entire Australian business, a complete hiring freeze, except in marketing and in risk. So their response culturally, that tells me that they're responding to this in a let's save our ass way, but are they genuinely investing in change in their business? Absolutely not. The same Big Four bank took a list of all of their donations and all of their sponsorships, and the top 20 on that list got their funding cut. So that's some of the fallout that you're talking about around what's happened and how they've chosen to respond. Yeah, it's very telling. On the flip side to that, out of the commission, there have been some, again, I'll go back to startups, there have been some startups popping up trying to respond to niche issues that are coming out of this. So, for example, one little startup who all they do is make the application process for, I have no idea, I can't talk finance. They make an application process to invest much, much simpler and automated. And they're now just that process is being purchased because the banks need to save money somewhere to cover these fines. So they're taking really great ideas and innovation, and they're creating opportunities in those spaces. So I guess that's a silver lining, perhaps.
Can I ask a question? And maybe you've got a couple of examples of, if clearly holding them accountable for their actions is not, you know, they brush it off pretty quickly and move on. Can you give some examples of what you think might be, you know, decent enough and I guess logical sort of punishments, I guess, or bringing people to justice for? I mean, how do you really hold a company of that size to account?
Well, at a simplistic level, the first thing they could have done was suspend their licence straight away. so they've been able to continue to go on and on and on over a period of time until such time as they've been, you know, now they've sold effectively, they've sold their books. You know, those banks that chose to get out of the wealth offering have sold their book to other players that have bought it, etc. So, I mean, at its rawest level, if they wanted to really make an example, because if you understand the industry, the banks were still receiving trailer commissions all the way through this journey of Royal Commission. You know, so if they really wanted to cause true financial, you know, suspend your licence, which means you can't operate in various spaces and so on. So,
Yeah.
but they'll never do it. They'll just never do it because they're one of the big four.
You've got to do such things.
I guess the flip side of that is APRA have, at a smaller bank level over history, have suspended licences of banks being able to operate for unethical behaviours and various things. So it's almost, you know, it's good enough for the small guy to really take the hard line. Is it right to do it to the big guy? You know, and it's, I guess that's the challenge, is there's always this, and I guess we see it no matter what the industry is, you know, for some reason, just in life, the small guy cops the raw end of the deal when someone big has done something wrong, you know, and I guess we talked about aged care. I've got no doubt we'll see similar sort of stories unfold in the aged care inquiry, where there'll be, you know, good operators doing the right thing, tarnished by virtue of association to an industry from a larger end.
100%, and it'll be the large ones that survive because
Correct.
they've got the resources to
Back
consolidate and eat up the smaller ones. To your point though, I'm the little guy. So I'm currently suffering from the Royal Commission because it's harder for us to get a business loan, it's harder for us to get a home loan. There's all of this fallout that have tightened, for the good of the community, that have tightened the screws around lending, that is going to impact my capacity to borrow money. So to take your point, all of this is in a context, yeah? It's all in a broader context, and the startup example doesn't work in every one of those contexts, I think. I'm much more willing to, you know, if there's a startup and they're trying to do what they can to maximise their income and minimise their tax, I'm much more okay with that than Google trying to do that. And so I think that it doesn't exist in a vacuum, this stuff.
Also, there is another side, I think, to it is, for example, a big guy or a big firm does a mistake. It could be even intentional because they know that there will be ripple effect of it, or there is a Royal Commission that's going to impose stricter laws which will end up closing out the smaller guys, and the whole business needs to come to me because there's no other way to go.
I'm
So
still here.
customers would
Still
ultimately
around.
go to the big guy who did the mistake and ended up losing the business for other people. So
Spot on.
it's not a fair world.
Tanya, do you have an example you'd like to work with?
Yeah, okay, let's carry on through that thread. I think it's a better question to ask, is there anyone who doesn't use Facebook? No. Oh, we have an outlier in the room.
Limited.
We have a couple of outliers in the room. So the vast majority of the room uses Facebook. I assume you guys both know someone who uses Facebook. Yeah, we all know. You've heard of it? Yeah. We all know what Facebook has done. We know that legislation has been passed, the data protection laws have been, regulation has come in to Australia, to the UK. Europe has stronger protections, etc. So regulation's kind of starting to step up here. Who changed or checked even their privacy settings after all of that happened? Did everyone in the room do that? So a few. So we sit here and say Facebook, they're terrible, they're awful, they're stealing our data, but not the whole room went in and actually checked your privacy settings to see what that actually meant. Following on from that, you might have heard that they're planning to get into crypto now. Yep. Right. So many things wrong with that. Yep. But what are we going to do to stop that? We've also got Facebook on our phones. You know, they're a big guy who we can sit back here and hate on. But then when they do something great and their marketing machine buzzes out that the new feature when there's a disaster and you can log your details to let people know you're okay, etc. The amount of press that got, timely press for them, I'm sure, that got, really shows the value, I guess, behind that marketing machine, and how it can be used to position actions of the biggest corporations for their own good or benefit.
What do you feel about deceitful CSR statements? I actually read an article from the University of Leeds that did a study on, I think it was 200 CSR reports or statements that had come out in 2018, and in one of the statements, and entirely legally, the company had hit a coal-fired power station that they had, and it was a legal process that they followed. And in one section there, they said in financial reporting to leave out an undisclosed part of a company in the calculation of profits would be a scandal. In sustainability reporting, it's common practice. So what are your thoughts on that? Because it kind of leads to another question I have about people using sustainability and CSR as a marketing strategy, which we just spoke to earlier. But then on the other side, I mentioned this when you guys arrived today, that there's multinational companies that are eager to tout their sustainability credentials, but they're also members of influential trade associations lobbying against the actual EU climate policy. So on one hand, they're saying how great they're doing, and on the other, they're giving $10 million to a lobbying association to go and fund ways of changing those policies and have more of a negative sort of impact. Can you speak to that a little bit and give us an idea, I guess, of how we can come up with some standardised measurement and reporting, and I guess how we can hold them a bit more accountable in those CSR reports? Steve?
I think it's a challenging one. I think, wherever there's regulation, there's always people trying to undermine regulation. So you can come up with all the rules and standards across the board, but ultimately if people want to go against what they are saying, then they will. That's the reality. I think, e.g. things like royal commissions and that are intended to try and bring that to the fore, but ultimately does it ever get conclusion? No, I don't think so. But I think the best again that can happen in those scenarios is, if they are deceitful in what they're doing, then ultimately, how does the price that they pay? Which is, e.g. walk with my feet, or karma at simplistic level. But it's a real challenging one, I mean, I think the natural reaction for everyone is put more standards, put more regulation, etc.
The more you do that, you're decreasing the whole ethos of free trade.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Open market and macroeconomies.
Yes.
So I think it's really important to note here that it's a global issue, and that's one thing that's difficult, is that you're working within member states or countries or states or whatever it might be, and you've got different legislation and licensing wherever you go, and so sustainability reporting can sit over the top of that, and there's a lot of choice in what frameworks you want to use. So our business, we use the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and they're mapped through a Compass tool to the Global Reporting Initiative. And so we meet the core competencies of the Global Reporting Initiative, and then there's a whole bunch of comprehensive standards you can do after that. But GRI is the most common tool used globally. However, it's not the only one. So we talked about B Corp before. B Corp can interact with GRI and also look at the outcomes with Sustainable Development Goals, but it's essentially different measurements, different accountabilities. And then you've got other things that might be niche on a particular area of sustainability. So you've got carbon disclosure projects and a whole range of different things around water, for instance. So it's a really challenging area around reporting, and that example you used, Jude, it might be legal that they aren't managing that power station or whatever, but if they're looking at their whole of business, they should be sustainability reporting for their whole of business, and thinking about what might be material to stakeholders. And I think hiding a power station would be quite a difficult thing to do.
You would think so, right?
Yeah, so reporting's really, really challenging, and I think the SDGs have galvanised government, community and business across the globe, and if we've ever been closer to getting global consensus on what this thing of sustainability actually is, it's that.
There's my personal point of view is that the decrease in quality in investigative journalism has contributed to this as well, because on the reporting structures, that's going to solve part of the issue, but also these one-off examples that you're speaking to, Jude, and I don't want this to be it's the media's fault kind of a comment, but I think we could all agree that the level of investigative journalism globally isn't what it used to be. And so there's a lack of, they speak for the public, I guess. It's in the public, journalism is in the public interest to look into these issues that regulators may not, or organisations aren't self-assessing.
It's a good point, because while I was trying to research and find some good examples, there is a lot of rubbish on the internet. It was pretty difficult to find. I went to the universities and tried to find white papers and things that they produced on certain topics, but there was a lot of rubbish out there. But I did find it interesting to read, while I was in the CSR side of things, to look at companies. I think it was Toyota, from hiding losses from investors. Their CEO's gone straight away, he's in jail, there's people getting pulled up everywhere, but yet there was a large Danish agriculture business that put together their CSR report for the year and forgot to mention that, or they said that they actually didn't realise that they owned a paper mill, which was a subsidiary of an acquisition that they had made. And I found it interesting that there was no real implications for that. It was just, you forgot to put that on. Whereas like they say in financial reporting, if you forget to put it in, you're held far more accountable for it. So it's interesting. It seems to be a real buzz at the moment, is the sustainability and the corporate social responsibility and things like that. But how accountable are these companies, and does it really have a huge impact when you'll read a bit further on with Volkswagen. They had a huge scandal in 2015. They picked up the pieces by 2016, and in 2017 they sold 10.7 million cars, which was a record for their business. So although there was a big loss, and they did obviously get held accountable to a degree, like you were saying earlier, Steve, businesses like that, it seems to sort of be wiped off. They pick themselves up again and they get on the way.
Yeah.
But you hope they learn a lesson along the way.
Yeah, I hope so.
You hope they learn a lesson along the way
do.
and they make some change.
Usually till they get caught next time.
Yeah, well that was what was interesting to read on, is it's not the first time automotive companies have deceived the public and their investors, so I'm sure it won't be the last.
That's right.
I wanted to bring it back, if you don't mind, Steve, to a bit more of a local.
Sure.
You spoke earlier about Drayton, and I really wanted to talk a bit more on that, if you don't mind.
Look, it's a case that's been, everyone's aware of the Anglo-Saxon trying to get the Drayton South coal mine extension there on the Golden Highway, backs onto the equine industry and the vineyards and so on up that way. I just find it a really interesting one. There's so many different pieces to CSR, in regards to, you've got sort of three industries where, the mining industry wanting to expand, and obviously, in their mind that's good from an economic perspective. I guess people looking in go, but that's not good from an environmental perspective. I'm sure they're sitting there going, well, socially it's good, because if we can expand, we can employ more people, which means, towns like Muswellbrook and Scone and those that border on where they are, is good for that community, and we've seen the positives that mining does put back into communities. And then on the flip side, you've got an equine industry saying, well, if we start getting too close, what's it do to our quality of thoroughbred? We're a worldwide industry, world renowned for what thoroughbreds we do put through the Hunter Valley, and you could go on and on, and so it's not so much there's a right answer or or a wrong answer, but it's just a really interesting thing for me around, well, where does CSR responsibility sit within that when you've got towns impacted by 3 industries where all those industries would influence the social economics in those towns, and then you've got the economics of it itself is, what's better, royalties from coal mining, horse sales from thoroughbreds, grapes in bottles going to China or wherever from a vineyard perspective. And it's just a real interesting one for me that I've sort of watched over time, and there's been some papers issued, where you see the arguments from Anglo-Saxon, and then you see the equine industry, back to the point of an industry coming together. The equine industry has come together despite their competition amongst each other to say, well, let's fight this together, So, yeah, for me, it's got a real mix of all these issues we're talking about.
And those 3 there are great examples, because I remember it was around sort of 2015, Drayton was really, there's just big decisions being made. They sent our company, sort of petitions to say, show how big the impact is. But within that, we were also getting information saying that the thoroughbred industry supports gambling. Drayton supports coal mining,
right.
which is not sustainable, and the wine industry, well, it's alcohol. So
That's right. It's got a whole mix
all
of
3 have got a negative, and it was just interesting to see. Wow, like you've mentioned, all 3 of you before, it is very personal.
Yeah.
And it just depends on what side of the fence or what
Absolutely.
perspective you're looking at things at. And thanks very much.
And then in that you've got the government trying to sort of play, whether it's planning from a mining perspective or quarantine from a thoroughbred perspective. You've got a whole mix of stakeholders that really, what is the right answer? I don't think there is a right answer.
And that issue you've described there too is essentially land use conflict, and you
Yeah.
see that play out time and time again in different scenarios. So Balmain, once upon a time in Sydney, was an industrial area.
It was.
Now look at it.
Yeah.
So at that time there would have been land use conflicts about how they move through that. That's no different to what we've experienced in the Hunter Valley with the Drayton example. And there's other areas in mining where you've got vineyards on top of a mine, olives on top of a mine. So there's ways to make these things work, but there's got to be some give and take in those relationships and how you develop forward.
And by getting those industries to come together and not necessarily bring them together to actually work together and come up with a solution themselves instead of putting it in somebody else's hands and giving it to a mediator to make the decision.
Yeah, sorry. To the point, it's just kind of timely with my organisation that I work with at the moment. They've actually announced that they've withdrawn all of their shares that they have in coal and tobacco and lots of other, industries that they've found to be unethical. And there's a lot of super funds that are now sort of coming out and saying we will only invest in ethical, industries. So how do you think that kind of plays into it? Obviously, for yourself, Trudy, you're working on sustainability. So do you think that's the right step for them to make, or do you think there's another way to look at it?
So that step's completely logical and rational for those businesses being super companies, and it has implications. So you will have seen Glencore's announcement on a cap of coal production. That's directly influenced by shareholders.
Yep.
And who are those major shareholders? Some of those super companies that you're talking about, and large hedge funds. So it's a real thing, and it's legitimate. So all businesses have a role in carving out what their legitimate path is and how they're going to interact with CSR and sustainability. So that might be right for them at that time.
It's also a consumer, sorry.
You go.
It's also a consumer product,
Absolutely.
isn't it?
Yes.
As a package, consumers are asking for that, so
Yeah.
let's not kid ourselves. They're packaging that up
Yeah.
for them.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think the challenge with it all is that there's no one aspect you can just look at. When people make those sort of decisions. I think the challenge is it's like business. You make certain decisions at certain points in time that to the average punter may not seem a rational or real decision, but they don't have the context of what's behind all that. And I think this is no different. It's all about the the context that sits behind why people are making those CSR decisions at that point in time.
Question. Would you agree, or what would your thoughts be if I think that there is necessarily a dollar value assigned to every CSR or sustainability, corporate social responsibility thing? Because if the dollar value is big enough, the responsibility or the social awareness can step away, and then you'll find a way around to get that in, or do good for the society in some other areas, but we still plow through on this particular business opportunity. For example, let's say mining is bad for the environment. So if the opportunity is big enough, like multiple $1 billion, sure, let's do mining and let's plant some trees on the side, you know? Do you agree to that kind of thing? And if that is the case, that is not really sustainable, because you are still damaging, let's say in this particular case, environment, but planting some trees and then digging is not really balanced out. Again, mining was just an example, and I'm coming from a mining industry, so I'm not having to get that.
So for me, that's about supply chain value as well. So,
So if there's demand,
yeah, there's a demand.
You will dig more and you'll make more coal, no matter if there's a social responsibility or any other thing, climatic change or anything, you'll still make money by digging, making
So
more coal.
you could replace coal with plastic
Yeah.
or palm oil, or
Waste.
if we're talking about commodities, there's a point in there you have to make some decisions, and I think putting a dollar figure on it is a tough thing to do, to balance one thing against the other. So rehab versus mining of coal, I find that a bit of a challenging concept.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
I think, it's, well, we're back to, there's still arguments on coal versus renewable energy versus alternate, the reality is we're not that far advanced in that technology for us all to sit here under the lights today. So like trying to put dollar values on it all the time just isn't practically reality. It's not reality in life, it's not reality in business, it's just not reality.
Where I think it can work in a positive frame. So if we look at diversity, for example, so just to flip it, and please stop me if I'm going too far from your point. Looking at diversity, an argument that's made to business is that a more diverse workforce will result in better outcomes for you from a revenue perspective through innovation, engagement of the workforce, etc., etc. So many organisations can come pretty close to putting a dollar value for the argument for diversity. Australia has diversity targets or goals. We haven't met them for, I think it might be 7 years. Trudy, you're probably more well versed than me.
Not sure.
We haven't met them for something like 7 years, but at an organisational level, making a business case for diversity is a pretty simple argument these days, I think. So it's kind of framing, putting that dollar value in a positive lens. If you do this, it's going to result in positive outcomes for your bottom line. Not the same thing?
No, I was more questioning on, I think please correct me if I didn't understand it correctly. Like, how do you stop a corporate from undertaking an opportunity that has got huge
Dollars.
business potential, revenue potential, strictly on the basis of social responsibility, as in, okay, this opportunity will gain this corporate millions of or billions of dollars, and on the side it will generate employment opportunities as well. But on a social environmental perspective, it is not. Let's say it's not good. Or
Not any
I think-
business, isn't it?
I think,
As any business is a
I think-
status quo without CSR. So you're going to go and dig up a hole and take coal out of it. You can go and do that. You don't have to be a good corporate citizen to do that.
yeah.
So it's not really a trade-off if that's just a
Yeah.
business to start with.
so basically, regulations should stop it.
Yeah,
To
but I
make
don't
it
think there is, I don't know, is there regulation
Well,
No, so not the concepts we've been talking about today, but there's definitely legislation that covers a lot of material aspects of it. So there's quite extensive environmental regulation, there's workplace discrimination legislation, there's all different pockets of it, but that's the thing. They're different sections of acts, some are Commonwealth, some are state, there's licensing, various scenarios, but at a concept level, that sustainability and CSR should really be driven by the business.
Just back to your point, I think the real challenge with it is in many ways, all of that's consumer driven. And what I mean by that is shareholders want a return on their money, employees want a wage, etc. So if you think about a business for a moment and take a large mining company, you know, they've got stakeholders of shareholders, employees, etc., etc. You know, they all want to get paid more, they all want to earn more. So, you know, ultimately there's some trigger point that says, well, I have to dig the next hole in the ground potentially if I want to sustain that in itself, you know. And so I think this is the whole challenge of it, is it's that balancing of where is the right answer on economic versus social versus environmental.
And it's back to that authentic, how you manage your business in an authentic way. And if you've got values, they're not just up on the shelf somewhere. How are you leading with them?
There's a good example of that is I had a bit of a chat to Tani about this the other day. But everybody seems to go to mining and power gen when it comes down to sustainability. But an interesting one, and I guess because it's close to me, is animal agriculture and how it impacts the world. So it has a bigger impact than mining and all transport logistics put together. Yet whenever you hear anybody talking about the greenhouse emissions and how it affects the world, nobody ever talks about their beloved steak or sausage. It's always about the mining company, or you know, I've actually been out and talking to people and they ask me what industry I work in, and suddenly they've just got this plethora of opinions, and I'm like, whoa. But I could stand back and say, oh, do you eat meat? But I think one good example of that is in the chicken industry. And I never knew how big the egg industry was until, again, I started researching this. But it is absolutely, it is massive. I couldn't even put a figure on it. It's so big. But one thing I found was really interesting is, as you said, the spin you put on your business, how you weave it into the fabric of your business. They knew that changes had to be made. They knew that putting a chicken in a cage that was no bigger than the size of its body for its entirety of its life, and then slaughter it after it's finished laying eggs, was not going to last with people and with consumers, like you said, Steve. So they took the same concept of having to use the animal to create the product, but then they've gone and put it into free range and open chicken coops, and you know, there's 10,000 acres for every one chicken at the moment. You see it on every package now. I'm sure it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but there's certainly, I think it's quite good to see a company that can still do what it has to do, and we still need eggs. Like, you know, it's a necessary evil. Yes, we need meat. Everybody knows where it comes from. They know what the impact is, but I like how a business can say, well, we know that we have to make some changes right now, because if we continue down this path, we're just going to get people walking away. It's, you know, there's going to be issues with our consumers. We're going to bring more negativity to our business. And I think it's a really intelligent one, particularly the Hunter Valley. There's a couple of providers up here that have just exploded in size because they were caged hens, and they decided to go to a different model. And then all around Australia, there's different suppliers that are like, well, we want to use your eggs. So it's actually been beneficial for their business, and they've grown their business tenfold because of it. So it's a good way of taking a negative sort of impact and making it positive within your business and within your vision as well. I just wanted to break it up now for about 10 minutes or so.
Finish.
Fine.
Righto. We've not got long till we've got to wrap it up, and I just wanted to put it out to everybody now and see if anybody had any questions that they wanted to ask, or anything that they wanted to raise that they found interesting in that article, including the panelists.
Steve's looking at me.
This group had a really good point.
I just had a question around how different the outcome could have been for Volkswagen if they'd self-declared.
Had the same one over here, yeah.
So if they had identified the problem, obviously the CEO was well aware of it, he was well reported on it, and if he had made an announcement to the media, to the world, and said, look, we've identified this problem, we apologise and this is what we're going to do about it, how much of an impact would that have had on their brand versus the way they did go about it?
What are your thoughts, Steve?
Oh, well, when we were talking about, I gave the example of Toyota. Toyota have made plenty of major callbacks on different models over the years, but still remain the number one seller of cars across the globe. So, you know, I said a good case in point where they've not been afraid for, you know, one of your points was how do you balance operating costs versus CSR? Well, at a point when they had a recall, that would have been a massive dent to the bottom line.
Yeah.
But their trend of sales continues to go like that today, you know, so.
And I think they just topped Toyota as
Yes, yeah, and we talked about, yeah, it's, they've stayed true to what they stand for, at whatever cost, which ultimately comes back in.
People value that.
Yeah.
And
And
the
it-
sustainability of their company then too.
Yes.
It's interesting that I didn't realise how much of the market in America is actually driven towards petrol and not diesel. I've spent 4 years, I lived in the UK for 4 years, and I got introduced to diesel over there. Everybody was running around in turbo diesel vehicles, and I thought, oh, this is, you know, great. Obviously, there's a lot of conversation going on about how they've got a lower impact to the planet, to our atmosphere. But then after this scandal came out, because there's a lot of lobbyists within America that actually didn't want the diesel vehicles coming in because they had ties to good old petrol, they then started looking into the actual impacts of diesel. And I think it was just Stuttgart just recently this year banned diesel vehicles from the city centre itself. So it's interesting that the impact on the actual company itself, you can see a monetary value there, but it's actually the impact that it's had on the industry and the impact, that the flow-on effect that it's had to other diesel car manufacturers as well, which I found was really interesting. And it's also going to damage Volkswagen moving forward, because they just released a report in 2000, just this year, that it's really starting to affect their sales, and they're now, I think, introducing 22 electric options, which should be available on the market by 2022. So it goes to show that, like Chanel said there, that's what was around if you disclosed it.
Transparent.
Yeah, if you're just a bit more transparent about it, that you know, it could have been a bit more of a positive outcome or a positive spin. I just use.
So this group in the corner here had a bit of a different view on that.
Hi, Jude.
Yeah.
I have a problem with that analogy, because the report itself says that it had record sales immediately after that event. So the impact of that, for example, if consumer did not trust a brand, the impact of that mistrust, what's that word? Lack of trust would have been the most critical immediately. Then later on it will fade away. That's how it works. So if the next year was record sales in the history of Volkswagen, then it clearly says that if they had come out by themselves, they would have still paid the fine, the engineer still would have gone to the jail, probably the CEO would have still been in his place. But they didn't do that. The only difference would be the CEO got replaced. They still paid the fine. They got record sales, because the apology that they issued, I happened to see that even was, the new CEO came into place. He was like, we are very sorry for what happened, and this is not what Volkswagen as a company stand for. But ta-da, there's a new Passat. Look at it. Let's talk about the Passat now.
They lowered their prices though.
And they have also talked about the heavy impact, as I was saying, that they're saying they haven't really seen the actual impact to that particular company and to that industry at this stage, because the impact it's had and the attention it's brought to diesel vehicles. And the US has the highest standards when it comes to testing emissions coming from vehicles, which I was quite surprised about. But they have talked about, you know, you might see a monetary figure right now, but the ongoing effect is going to be the big impact, because it's bringing a lot of attention to diesel vehicles, which is, you know, I believe it's about 85% of the vehicles that they produce. So it's interesting. I only read this one today, that the effects they're trying to say now, that if all the customers that bought those vehicles haven't taken up the option to get a refund, I think by the end of 2018, they're saying that that's sort of where they can start marching forward and set some new strategy. But some of the research that's coming out is saying that 2019, 20, 21, 22 is when they're really going to start seeing the impacts. So,
Do we think the outcome would have been the same if it was a safety issue? And what does that tell us about the environmental impact versus the safety issue? So if Volkswagen had screwed up with the what was the company that it was the airbags?
Yeah.
Thank you.
yeah.
So if it had been something like that, would that have changed our view? Would that have changed the sales? And does that mean that we care, if it's something we care about more, it changes the way we view it?
I'm going to ask a question. Obviously, the three of you guys are all leaders from your own organisations, and I wanted to ask a question on how CSR affects leadership. Steve, if you'd like to.
I think it's really important. I think it's back to the case study there with Volkswagen. You know, ultimately, it goes hand in hand with culture. You know, the leadership creating the right culture around CSR. So, you know, you sort of can't separate the two, I don't think, you know. But at the end of the day, we come back to, you can be a great leader, create a great culture, but around these sort of things, individuals will make their own choice. But what you tend to find is if, you know, individuals will align themselves with a culture. So people stay in an organisation because they usually believe in it and, you know, feel part of it. So I think it's all about that alignment piece of leadership, culture, and what employees are after.
Barney?
It's important to ask your teams what's important to them on a bigger picture scale. We don't talk much anymore about work-life balance because it all operates in the same ecosystem, and, you know, we need to figure out how that all works together. So to understand what's important to them and their core values, and not try to force that into a rah-rah cheerleader type vision and mission in the name of CSR, because then it becomes a marketing ploy and it becomes inauthentic. For smaller organisations, I think it's about doing good and go deep into something that you as an organisation really believe in. Your resources might not stretch to do everything, but choose what it is that you believe in and live it, filter it through your values as well.
Trudy?
Just sort of to build on what the others have said, I think that's really important that it's purposeful and that go deep. I like that. That could be for any size organisation. Figure out what your purpose is and think about the context that you're within. I think we can't forget that context, because you can get quite carried away with the idealism around CSR or sustainability. So use it as your moral compass and make good decisions as a leader.
Thank you. Well, that's going to wrap everything up tonight. I just wanted to thank our three panellists for coming along, Steve, Tani and Trudy. Really appreciate your time and your insights, and have a nice bottle of Cab Sav there for you to curl up with tonight. Everybody please.